Some people think the loudest voice owns the land. They usually learn the truth the hard way. The sharp chirp of a police cruiser rolling across gravel shattered the stillness of the lake just as I slid my old brass key into the cabin door. Morning mist drifted over the water in slow ribbons, carrying the scent of pine, damp cedar, and fresh coffee from somewhere across the shoreline. The cabin looked exactly the way I remembered it, weathered cedar siding glowing gold beneath the first light, the same rocking chair my father built decades ago still facing the lake, waiting for another quiet sunrise. I barely had time to turn the lock before a woman's voice sliced through the peaceful morning like a boat horn echoing across calm water. "Officer, that's him. He's breaking into HOA property." I closed my eyes for half a second and let out the smallest breath. I didn't turn around immediately. There was something strangely familiar about hearing confidence built on a foundation of complete ignorance. Gravel crunched beneath polished shoes as two deputies approached behind me. Their radios crackled softly while the woman hurried toward them, her white designer jacket somehow spotless despite the dusty road. Even before I looked at her, I recognized the perfume drifting through the cool air. Expensive, overwhelming, the kind of fragrance that arrived several seconds before its owner. Victoria Collins, president of the Clearwater Pines HOA. She walked with the certainty of someone who had never been told no for very long. Her perfectly styled blonde hair barely moved in the breeze as she pointed directly at me. "I've been warning this trespasser for months," she declared. "He's trying to steal one of our community cabins." One deputy nodded politely before looking at me. "Morning, sir. Mind stepping away from the door while we sort this out?" I smiled, not because anything about the situation was funny, but because I'd learned years ago that patience unsettles people who expect panic. I quietly removed the key from the lock and slipped it into my jacket pocket without saying a word. Victoria crossed her arms, clearly mistaking silence for surrender. Around us, curtains shifted, screen doors opened. Neighbors wandered onto porches with steaming coffee mugs, eager for free entertainment before breakfast. They whispered to each other while pretending not to stare. A pair of fishermen slowed their aluminum boat just offshore, letting the trolling motor hum quietly as they watched the scene unfold. The entire lakeside community seemed convinced they were about to witness another HOA victory. The deputy glanced back toward Victoria. "Ma'am, how long have you known this individual?" She answered before he even finished speaking. "Long enough to know he doesn't belong here." I finally turned to face her completely. She looked at me for barely 2 seconds before dismissing me with the same confident smile she'd probably practiced in every HOA meeting she'd ever chaired. She believed the badge standing beside her automatically made her right. She believed the crowd behind her made her powerful. She believed the cabin, the shoreline, and maybe even the morning itself belonged to her little association. She was wrong on every count. What Victoria Collins didn't know was that every month for nearly 3 years, the rent check keeping a roof over her own head had ultimately found its way to me. My name is Ethan Carter, and despite what most people assumed when they looked at my faded pickup truck and worn hiking boots, I had never needed a fancy title to own something valuable. My grandfather bought the first piece of Clearwater Lake shoreline in 1968, back when the nearest grocery store was almost 30 miles away, and people laughed at the idea that anyone would build vacation cabins this far into the woods. He believed water was the one investment people could never manufacture, and every spare dollar he earned as a carpenter went toward another stretch of shoreline. My father expanded that vision one cabin at a time, swinging his own hammer, laying every cedar board by hand, and teaching me that ownership was not measured by how loudly you announced it, but by how carefully you protected it. The cabin standing behind me that morning was the first one we ever finished together. I was 12 years old when he let me drive the last nail into the dock. I could still remember the smell of fresh sawdust mixing with lake water, the rough grain of unfinished cedar against my fingertips, and the sound of loons calling across the water just before sunset. Those memories mattered far more to me than the property itself ever could. As the years passed, our family gradually placed every cabin under Carter Lake Properties, a company that quietly managed rentals, maintenance, taxes, insurance, and long-term leases throughout the shoreline community. We hired local managers because I spent most of my time traveling between projects across several states, restoring historic lodges and overseeing commercial developments. I rarely introduced myself as the owner because I found people treated maintenance workers with more honesty than they treated landlords. You learn a great deal when nobody believes you have authority. Every month, I reviewed maintenance reports, lease renewals, inspection photographs, and repair invoices from wherever I happened to be working. I knew which dock boards needed replacing after winter storms, which cabins required new roofs, and which tenants always planted flowers before Memorial Day. I even recognized certain homes by the sound their screen doors made during inspection videos. One name appeared in those monthly reports often enough to become familiar without ever becoming important. Victoria Collins. Reliable rent payments. 3-year residential lease. No missed installments. Routine maintenance requests. Nothing remarkable. She was simply another tenant among dozens of families enjoying property my grandfather had once cleared with nothing more than an old chainsaw and determination. Ironically, while she spent weekends attending HOA meetings and enforcing neighborhood rules, every payment she believed was going to an investment company ultimately flowed into the business account, carrying my family name. She never met me because she never needed to. Our property manager handled every signature, every renewal, and every inspection. That arrangement suited me perfectly until the morning I returned to spend a quiet weekend at the original lakeside cabin. Standing there, beside those deputies, breathing the crisp air rolling off the water, I realized something my father used to tell me had never been more true. People become remarkably confident when they mistake familiarity for ownership, and confidence built on assumption almost always collapses the moment it meets documented truth. Victoria Collins did not become president of the Clearwater Pines Homeowners Association because people admired her. She became president because everyone else was tired of arguing with her. By the time I quietly returned to the lake that spring, she had spent almost 4 years turning neighborhood meetings into personal performances. She drove a white luxury sport utility vehicle that always looked freshly detailed, wore crisp resort clothing even for routine board meetings, and carried a leather binder thick enough to make every conversation feel like a courtroom hearing. Every rule sounded like federal law when it came out of her mouth. Even though most of them were nothing more than association guidelines, she repeated often enough that people stopped questioning them. The strange thing was that Clearwater Pines had once been known for its relaxed atmosphere. Families waved from fishing docks. Children rode bicycles until sunset. Neighbors borrowed ladders from one another without filling out forms or asking permission. Little by little, that changed. Decorative signs appeared at every entrance reminding residents about approved mailbox colors, approved landscaping, approved outdoor furniture, approved holiday decorations, and approved parking schedules. People began checking their driveways before leaving for work, wondering whether another violation notice had been slipped beneath the windshield wiper overnight. Victoria never shouted. She never needed to. Her smile stayed perfectly composed while she quietly convinced people that disagreement itself was a community violation. She liked using official-sounding phrases that made ordinary homeowners nervous. Compliance review, community enforcement, property standards, safety inspection. Most people simply apologized and paid whatever fine appeared in the mailbox because arguing seemed more expensive than surrendering. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. She spent every month lecturing homeowners about respecting private property while living in a house she did not actually own. Of course, she believed she did. The lease had been renewed through our management company for years, and she had probably never looked beyond the company letterhead or the electronic payment portal. To her, the owner was some distant investment business that existed only as paperwork. She had no reason to imagine the quiet man standing beside the deputies owned not only the lakeside cabin in front of her, but also the home where she hosted every board meeting and every neighborhood gathering. Over the past several months, I had noticed something unusual in the management reports. Complaints about the original lakeside cabin kept increasing despite the property sitting vacant between seasonal visits. Unauthorized structure, unsafe appearance, possible trespassing risk, requests to transfer ownership to the association for community use. Every recommendation carried Victoria's name somewhere in the file. She wanted that cabin badly. Maybe she imagined turning it into an exclusive clubhouse overlooking the water. Maybe she simply disliked the idea that one property remained outside her influence. Whatever the reason, each report grew a little more aggressive than the last. My property manager always responded the same way, politely explaining that ownership records were clear and no transfer had been authorized. Apparently, that answer was never good enough for Victoria Collins. Standing there with the deputies waiting for my response, she looked completely certain the next few minutes would end with me leaving the property. She had no idea that every confident word she spoke was quietly building the very foundation beneath the truth that was about to change everything. The older deputy shifted his weight on the gravel and glanced from me to Victoria as though he had already seen this kind of neighborhood dispute 100 times before. The younger one opened a small notebook and asked for my identification. I handed it over without hesitation. Victoria folded her arms. With obvious satisfaction, tapping one perfectly manicured finger against the leather binder she carried everywhere. The faint breeze carried the smell of lake water and freshly cut grass, while the only sound came from a flag gently snapping above the nearby marina. Everything about the morning felt peaceful except the growing confidence on Victoria's face. "You see," she said to the deputies, "this is exactly what we have been dealing with for months. He keeps appearing at this cabin, acting like he belongs here, even after the association made it perfectly clear this property falls under community control." The older deputy looked toward the cabin and asked, "Do you have documentation showing that?" Victoria smiled immediately, flipping open her binder with the practiced motion of someone who enjoyed performing authority. She produced printed violation notices, photographs of the cabin, copies of HOA meeting minutes, and several letters requesting that the property be transferred into association management. She laid them across the hood of the patrol vehicle as though she were presenting evidence in court. Every page looked official. Every page carried signatures, dates, committee stamps, and carefully highlighted sections. To anyone standing nearby, it probably appeared overwhelming. Several neighbors slowly drifted closer, coffee mugs still in their hands, whispering quietly as they watched the paperwork accumulate. One elderly man adjusted his glasses and nodded toward Victoria as if the stack of documents alone settled the matter. She noticed the growing audience, and her confidence expanded with it. "This cabin has been abandoned for years," she continued. "The association has repeatedly tried to preserve it for community use. We have documented every concern. We have followed every procedure." She spoke so smoothly that even I almost admired the performance. The deputies carefully reviewed each page while I remained beside the porch railing, saying almost nothing. My silence seemed to frustrate Victoria more than any argument could have. She wanted resistance. She wanted raised voices. She wanted the crowd to watch another homeowner lose to the association. Instead, she found herself filling every moment of silence with more assumptions. She pointed toward the dock where the weathered cedar boards stretched into the still water. "We even had to prevent unauthorized use of the shoreline because people like him create liability issues." I looked out across the lake where sunlight now danced across the surface exactly the way it had when my father first finished building that dock decades earlier. The memories felt far more solid than the accusations echoing behind me. One deputy finally looked up from the paperwork and turned toward me. "Sir, is there anything you would like to tell us before we decide how to proceed?" I slipped one hand into my jacket pocket, feeling the familiar weight of the old brass key resting against my fingertips. My father always said that paper could create confusion, but original ownership had a way of clearing the air remarkably fast. I met the deputy's eyes and answered with complete calm. "Actually, officer, before anyone makes a decision, would you mind telling me one thing? According to your county property database, who owns lot 17? The question seemed almost too simple, yet the effect was immediate. The older deputy looked at me for a moment, then toward his partner, who was already reaching for the patrol vehicle computer. Victoria let out a short laugh that sounded more confident than amused. "That is not relevant," she said quickly. "The association manages this entire section of the neighborhood." I did not argue. I simply waited. The younger deputy typed the parcel number printed on one of Victoria's own documents, carefully matching it with the county records database. The soft clicking of the keyboard was suddenly louder than every whisper drifting through the gathering crowd. A pair of geese glided across the calm lake behind us while somewhere in the distance a fishing boat engine started and slowly faded away. It was remarkable how ordinary the morning remained, while everyone standing on that gravel road expected something dramatic to happen. Victoria stepped closer to the patrol vehicle and leaned toward the computer screen. "You do not need to waste time with county records," she insisted. "The association has already documented everything." The deputy smiled politely without stopping his search. "Ma'am, property ownership always comes from county records first." That single sentence caused the first crack in her confidence. She took half a step back and folded her arms again, but this time the movement felt less certain. Around us, neighbors continued watching in complete silence. Some shifted their weight from one foot to the other. Others glanced between me and Victoria as though trying to decide which version of the story made more sense. I recognized several faces from inspection reports over the years, families who had rented lakeside homes through our company without ever realizing who owned them. They knew me only as another visitor in an old pickup truck. None of them had any reason to believe otherwise. The deputy continued reading information from the screen, his expression growing more focused with every line. He looked at the parcel map, zoomed in, then compared it with the address printed across Victoria's paperwork. Without saying a word, he opened another record connected to the neighboring properties. I noticed his eyebrows lift slightly before he exchanged a quick glance with his partner. Victoria noticed it too. "Well?" she asked, forcing a smile that looked increasingly uncomfortable. "What does it say?" Instead of answering immediately, the deputy turned toward me. "Sir, could I ask whether you have any identification that matches the name listed here?" Calmly, I reached into my wallet and handed him my driver's license. He compared it to the screen for several seconds before looking back at me with an expression completely different from the one he had worn only minutes earlier. Respect quietly replaced suspicion. He handed my license back with both hands and cleared his throat. Victoria stared at him, waiting for reassurance that never came. The crowd seemed to sense the atmosphere changing even before anyone spoke. The younger deputy closed the computer halfway and said carefully, "There is one more thing we should verify before we go any further." I nodded once, removed my phone from my pocket, and dialed a number I knew by memory. When the call connected, I spoke only one sentence. "Good morning, Lisa. Would you please bring the original lease file for Clearwater Lakeside, Lot 17? I think everyone here deserves to see it." Less than 15 minutes later, a dark blue company sport utility vehicle turned onto the gravel road and rolled slowly toward the cabin. The familiar Carter Lake Properties logo on the driver door caught my eye long before anyone else seemed to notice it. Lisa Monroe stepped out carrying a thick gray document case tucked beneath one arm and a tablet in the other hand. She had managed our shoreline properties for nearly 12 years and knew every lease, every maintenance record, and every parcel boundary better than anyone I had ever hired. She greeted the deputies first with calm professionalism before walking over to me. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said naturally, as though this were nothing more than another routine property inspection. The effect of those 4 words was impossible to miss. Several neighbors exchanged puzzled looks. The younger deputy glanced toward the patrol vehicle computer again, silently confirming what he had already found. Victoria frowned as though she had heard something that simply did not fit the version of reality she had constructed. "Mr. Carter?" she repeated slowly. Lisa nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am. Ethan Carter, managing owner of Carter Lake Properties." For several seconds nobody said anything. Even the breeze seemed to pause as leaves hung almost perfectly still above the shoreline. Lisa opened the document case and carefully removed a certified copy of the county deed, followed by a property survey map and a current lease file. She laid each document across the hood of the patrol vehicle beside the stack of association papers Victoria had proudly presented only minutes earlier. The contrast was striking. The HOA documents described rules and requests. The county records established ownership. Lisa pointed first to the survey. "This parcel is Lot 17. It has remained under Carter family ownership since 1968. She then placed the certified deed. Beside it, ownership transferred into Carter Lake Properties as part of the family trust restructuring. Mr. Ethan Carter is the managing owner authorized to make all leasing and property decisions." The older deputy carefully examined the embossed county seal before nodding. "Everything matches our database." Lisa then opened the lease file and turned several pages until she reached the signature section. This is the current residential lease for the property occupied by Ms. Victoria Collins. She gently rotated the document so everyone standing nearby could see the names printed across the page. Tenant, Victoria Collins. Property owner, Carter Lake Properties. Authorized signature, Ethan Carter. I watched Victoria's expression change as recognition slowly replaced certainty. Her eyes moved from the lease to my face, then back to the signature she had apparently never bothered to read during any of her renewals. The confidence that had filled every sentence she spoke that morning quietly disappeared. Nobody laughed. Nobody celebrated. The truth required no performance. The younger deputy closed his notebook and addressed the situation in an even, respectful tone. Based on the county records and these certified documents, Mr. Carter is lawfully present on property owned by his company. At this time, we do not have any basis to ask him to leave. The neighbors who had gathered along the roadside stood in complete silence. Some stared at the deed. Others looked toward Victoria with expressions of genuine disbelief. The same crowd that had expected to witness an unwanted visitor being removed from the property had just learned they had been watching the owner unlock his own front door all along. Victoria stared at the lease for several long seconds without saying a word, as though reading the same line over and over might somehow change the name printed above the signature. Her shoulders remained perfectly straight, but the confidence that had carried every sentence she spoke earlier had quietly disappeared. The neighbors who had gathered around the patrol vehicle slowly leaned closer, not to invade anyone's privacy, but because they sensed they were watching something far more unusual than a simple property disagreement. They were watching certainty collide with documented fact. Lisa calmly organized the remaining files and placed another folder on the hood beside the certified deed. "Since everyone is here," she said in her steady professional voice, "it may also be helpful to clarify the recent correspondence regarding this property." She opened the folder to reveal copies of emails, maintenance requests, and certified letters exchanged over the previous several months. Every request submitted by the Homeowners Association asking to assume control of the lakeside cabin had been answered politely and consistently. Every response explained that the property was privately owned, not part of the association's common area, and not available for transfer. Every letter had been acknowledged as received. The older deputy quietly reviewed several pages before handing them back to Lisa. "It appears your office responded to every inquiry." Lisa nodded. "We always do." She then selected another document. "This is the maintenance authorization for the dock repairs completed last autumn. Approved by Mr. Carter." Another page followed. "This is the roofing inspection authorized by Mr. Carter." Then another. "And this is the seasonal insurance renewal for the cabin, also signed by Mr. Carter." The growing stack of documents painted a remarkably simple picture. While the association had been attempting to claim authority over the property, every legitimate decision concerning the cabin had continued flowing through my office exactly as it always had. There had never been confusion within the legal record. The confusion existed only in assumptions. Victoria finally broke the silence. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice noticeably quieter than before. Lisa answered respectfully. "No mistake, ma'am. The ownership history has remained unchanged for decades." One of the neighbors, an older gentleman who had watched the entire exchange from the edge of the road, slowly removed his cap and looked toward Victoria. "Does that mean the cabin was never HOA property?" Lisa offered a polite smile. "That is correct. It has always been privately owned." A ripple of quiet conversation moved through the small crowd. People began remembering board meetings, newsletters, and discussions where the cabin had repeatedly been described as a future community asset. Those statements suddenly sounded very different in light of the official records resting on the patrol vehicle. The younger deputy closed his notebook completely and addressed everyone present in an even, measured tone. "Based on everything we have reviewed today, this appears to be a civil misunderstanding rather than any criminal matter. Mr. Carter has every legal right to access his property." I simply thanked both deputies for taking the time to verify the records instead of accepting assumptions. My father used to remind me that truth rarely needed to speak first. It only needed the opportunity to be heard. Standing beside the lake he loved, watching official documents quietly accomplish what arguments never could, I realized his lesson had never been more accurate. Authority may impress people for a moment, but ownership supported by patience, records, and integrity always speaks with the strongest voice. The deputies returned the certified documents to Lisa, and the atmosphere along the shoreline changed in a way that no raised voice ever could have accomplished. Only 20 minutes earlier, nearly everyone standing there believed they were watching an unwanted visitor being removed from private property. Now they understood they had witnessed the actual owner patiently unlock his own cabin while assumptions unraveled one by one. Victoria looked down at the binder she had carried with such confidence that morning. It suddenly seemed much lighter than the county records resting inside Lisa's document case. One of the deputies spoke in a calm, professional tone. "Ma'am, now that ownership has been verified, I would recommend working through any remaining concerns directly with the property owner or through legal channels if necessary." There was no accusation in his voice, only a reminder that official procedures exist for a reason. Victoria gave a small nod, but said nothing. For the first time since she arrived, she appeared to realize that authority does not come from titles printed on business cards or seats at board meetings. It comes from facts that can withstand verification. As the crowd slowly began drifting back toward their homes, several neighbors paused beside me. An older couple apologized for assuming the worst when they saw the patrol vehicles arrive. Another resident quietly admitted he had always wondered why the association seemed unusually determined to control a cabin that was rarely occupied. I thanked each of them and told them there was nothing to apologize for. Most people simply trusted the information they were given. That was understandable. The important part was being willing to accept the truth once it became clear. Lisa gathered the remaining files before handing me one final envelope. "There is one additional item you should probably review," she said. Inside was a summary of correspondence from the past year. Along with repeated requests to obtain the cabin, there were proposals submitted by the association suggesting that the shoreline and dock be converted into exclusive community amenities. Every proposal had already received the same written response from our office. Politely declined. Ownership unchanged. Existing property rights remain in effect. Reading those familiar letters reminded me why my father insisted on documenting everything. Memories fade. Opinions change. Proper records quietly endure. Before leaving, the older deputy shook my hand. "Thank you for your patience today, Mr. Carter. Situations like this become much easier when everyone relies on verified records instead of assumptions." I appreciated his professionalism because he had taken the time to confirm the facts instead of accepting the loudest voice in the conversation. As the patrol vehicles disappeared down the winding lakeside road, the peaceful sounds of the morning gradually returned. Birds settled back into the trees. Gentle waves brushed against the cedar dock. Somewhere across the lake, someone laughed as a fishing line splashed into the water. It felt as though the shoreline itself had simply been waiting for the unnecessary noise to end. I unlocked the cabin door once more, stepped inside, and paused to look at the old brass key resting in my hand. It had opened this same door for generations of my family, and on that quiet morning it had unlocked something else as well. Not revenge, not humiliation, just the simple satisfaction that comes when truth is given enough time to speak for itself. I stayed at the cabin until the sun slipped low behind the line of tall pines, painting the lake with shades of amber and deep blue that my father always claimed were worth more than any expensive vacation in the world. The quiet had finally returned. Every wave that brushed against the dock sounded familiar again, and every creak of the old cedar porch reminded me why this place had never been just another property on a balance sheet. It was part of my family's story. Before leaving that afternoon, Lisa handed me copies of the verified records we had presented earlier, neatly organized back into the gray document case where they belonged. She smiled and said, "I have a feeling nobody is going to question who owns this cabin again." I smiled back because I knew the documents had never really been the important part. They were simply the bridge between truth and understanding. During the following weeks, life around Clearwater Lake quietly settled into its normal rhythm. Residents waved again as neighbors passed one another on morning walks. Families returned to fishing from the shoreline. Children laughed as bicycles rolled down the same peaceful streets that had briefly become the stage for unnecessary conflict. I heard through Lisa that the association board reviewed several of its internal procedures after realizing how easily assumptions had replaced verified information. Future property questions would require county records before public claims were made. That seemed like a sensible lesson for everyone involved. As for Victoria, our interactions became brief, respectful, and entirely professional. She fulfilled the obligations outlined in her lease, and every communication went through the property management office exactly as it always should have. There was no reason for anger, and there was certainly no reason for revenge. Once the facts became clear, the situation no longer needed emotion to keep moving forward. Sometimes accountability arrives quietly, carried by paperwork instead of raised voices. A few months later, I returned to the cabin on another cool morning. I parked the same old pickup truck beneath the towering pines, walked to the familiar front door, and reached into my jacket pocket for the same worn brass key my father had trusted me with all those years ago. The lock turned smoothly, just as it always had. I stepped onto the porch before going inside and looked across the calm lake where the first rays of sunlight shimmered across the water. It occurred to me that nothing about the land had changed during all the arguments. The shoreline had remained patient. The trees had remained rooted. The cabin had remained exactly where my grandfather first imagined it would stand. Only people's assumptions had shifted. My father once told me that ownership is not proven by the loudest opinion in the room, but by the quiet responsibility of caring for something year after year. Standing there with that old brass key in my hand, I finally understood the full meaning of his words. Real authority does not demand attention. It earns trust. Real confidence does not come from telling everyone you are in charge. It comes from knowing the truth can withstand every question. And on that peaceful lakeside morning, I locked the cabin behind me, slipped the brass key back into my pocket, and drove away knowing that justice had never needed to raise its voice because patience, integrity, and the truth had already said everything that mattered.